There comes a moment in the deep chambers of the psyche when the mirrors we have polished for others begin to crack. Not from external force, but from the trembling hand of truth itself. You have been there, mirror perfect, gleaming, reflecting. Back, not reality, but the golden lie they needed to see. For years, perhaps decades, you held this sacred and terrible role. Your very being bent into the shape of their reflected glory. But mirrors, Jung understood, are more than glass and silver. They are portals between worlds, the world of illusion and the world of what is. When you begin to heal, when you start the ancient work of reclaiming your soul from the fragments scattered across their needs, something profound shifts in the cosmic order they have constructed. The mirror begins to crack, and through those hairline fractures, reality seeps in like water through a dam. Picture Narcissus by the pool, gazing into waters that have always shown him the face he believes himself to possess, beautiful, flawless, worthy of worship. But imagine now that the water begins to clear, the ripples settle, and suddenly he sees not the idealized vision, but his actual face. Marked by time, hollow with hunger, twisted by the very obsession that has consumed him. This is the terror the narcissist experiences when you begin to heal. Your recovery is their apocalypse, not the end of the world, but the revealing of what has always been true. In the beginning of your relationship with them, whether romantic, familial, or otherwise, you were recruited into a cosmic drama. They needed someone to play the role of the perfect witness, the one who would see their magnificence and reflect it back without question. You became their living mirror, your emotions their validation, your attention their sustenance. But this was never about you. It was about maintaining the elaborate theater of their false self. The false self, that magnificent construction Jung called the persona, is like a suit of armor worn so long that the person forgets there is skin beneath. For the narcissist, this armor has become their identity. They cannot remove it without feeling they will dissolve into nothing. And you, dear mirror, have been the one reflecting the light off this armor, making it gleam, making it seem real and substantial. But healing is alchemy. It is the slow transformation of lead into gold, of unconsciousness into awareness, of fragmentation into wholeness. As you begin this sacred work, as you start to separate your true face from the reflection they demanded you hold, the quality of light you cast begins to change. No longer do you reflect their golden lies. Instead, you begin to emanate your own light, the silver radiance of authenticity. This shift is catastrophic for them. Imagine a person who has spent their entire existence in a hole of mirrors, each one carefully positioned to show only their most flattering angles. Suddenly, one mirror, the one they trusted most, begins to show the truth. The other mirrors haven't changed, but this one, crack in their reflected reality, threatens to bring down the entire whole. Your healing forces them to confront what Jung called the shadow wall, the parts of themselves they have spent lifetimes disowning. They have painted their inadequacies onto you, their fears and failures and shame. You have carried these projections like a sacred burden, believing them to be true, integrating them into your sense of self. But as you heal, as you begin to sort what is yours from what belongs to them, these projections return home like homing pigeons, carrying messages they don't want to read. The persona they wear begins to crack under the pressure of authentic reflection. This armor, polished to perfection through your devoted mirroring, starts to show its age, its dents, its fundamental inadequacy. They feel naked, exposed, as if walking through the world with their clothes suddenly transparent. The gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are becomes visible, and your healing light illuminates this chasm with merciless clarity. This is why your growth feels like betrayal to them. You were supposed to remain frozen in the moment of their greatest glory, a living photograph of their idealized self. Your healing represents a violation of the unspoken contract that bound you together. You were the keeper of their full self, the guardian of their illusion. And now you have committed the ultimate act of treachery. You have chosen reality over their fantasy on your wholeness. They glimpse the void they have spent lifetimes avoiding, the black hole at the center of their being where the authentic self should dwell. This void is not evil. It is simply empty, a space that was never filled with genuine self-love, never cultivated with the patient work of individuation. They have built their entire identity around avoiding this emptiness, and your healing threatens to drag them into its gravitational pull. The mirror breaks not with violence, but with the gentle, inevitable force of truth. Each step you take toward healing creates another fracture in their reflected world. Your joy cracks their need for your sorrow. Your peace shatters their requirement for your chaos. Your self-love explodes their dependence on your self-hatred. With each authentic breath you take, their house of mirrors trembles. And so they watch, horrified, as their perfect mirror transforms into something else entirely, a window. No longer reflecting their false glory back to them, you become transparent, clear, allowing light to pass through you rather than bouncing off you. They can see through you now to the world beyond, a world where healing is possible, where authenticity exists, where people can love themselves without diminishing others. This transparency is perhaps the most threatening thing of all. When you were their mirror, you were useful, necessary, controllable. But now, as a window, you serve a different purpose entirely. You offer a view into territories they dare not explore, the landscape of genuine selfhood, the topography of earned peace, the geography of a soul that has learned to call itself home. There was a time when you were sacred to them, not in the way of true divinity, but in the way of a broken altar upon which they could place their unexamined hunger for power. You became their temple of shadows, where they could genuflect before their own inflated sense of self, while never having to look directly into the mirror of their own soul. Your wounds were their liturgy, your silence their most cherished hymn. In the cathedral of your diminishment, they found that false God, Ho-O-D. This is the terrible alchemy of the unconscious relationship, how one person's descent becomes another's ascension, how your voluntary crucifixion becomes their borrowed resurrection. You offered yourself as the sacrificial lamb upon the altar of their ego, believing perhaps that love required such offerings, that connection demanded such surrender. But what you could not see then, what the wounded psyche never recognizes, in its fog of pain, is that you were not serving love at all. You were serving their neurosis, feeding their desperate need to remain unconscious by becoming the repository for all they could not bear to face within themselves. Jung knew this dynamic wealth, the way the psyche will unconsciously seek out relationships that allow it to project its unwanted contents onto another. The narcissist does not love you. They love the God they have made of your suffering. They worship at the shrine of your silenced voice, because in your silence, they need never hear the terrible truth of their own emptiness. Your pain becomes their opium, your confusion their clarity, your self-doubt their certainty. Through your systematic diminishment, they construct an elaborate mythology of their own specialness. But then comes the moment when you begin to stir from this sacred sleep, when the first flicker of consciousness ignites in the darkness of your unconscious participation in their ritual. This is when you commit the ultimate heresy against that false religion. You begin to heal. You start to question the sacred texts of their criticism, to doubt the holy commandments of their expectations. You dare to suggest that perhaps you are not the problem, that perhaps the altar was never meant to hold you. The moment you take your first step toward individuation, toward reclaiming the fragments of self you have scattered as offerings at their feet, you become their antichrist. Your healing becomes a direct threat to their carefully constructed cosmology, where they are the sun and you are the grateful planet, forever orbiting in their gravitational pull. When you begin to generate your own light, when you dare to shine with your own radiance, you expose the terrible truth. They were never gods at all, merely humans desperately afraid of their own mortality, their own insignificance, their own profound need for love. This is the moment of Enantiodromia, Jung's concept of the inevitable reversal of psychological opposites. What was once your darkness becomes your dawn. What was once their power becomes their panic. The very consciousness they sought to suppress in you begins to illuminate the unconsciousness they have been so desperately protecting in themselves. Your awakening becomes the mirror they can no longer avoid, the reflection that shows them not the God they believed themselves to be, but the frightened child they have always been. Watch how they respond to your emerging selfhood, not with celebration, but with fury, not with pride in your growth, but with rage at your betrayal of their false mythology. They will accuse you of changing, as if change were not the very essence of life itself. They will mourn the loss of your compliance, as if it were a death in the family. In truth, it is a death, the death of the false god they created through your voluntary sacrifice. The neurotic, Jung observed, has an investment in remaining unconscious, for consciousness brings with it the terrible burden of responsibility. As long as you remained the identified patient, the broken one, the one who needed fixing, they could maintain their illusion of wholeness. Your pathology was their health, your chaos their order, your questions their answers. But when you begin to heal, when you start to integrate your shadow and reclaim your projections, you force them to confront the projections they have placed upon you. Suddenly, they must face the possibility that the anger they saw in you was actually their own rage, projected outward to avoid the pain of acknowledgement. The weakness they identified in you becomes recognizable as their own terror of vulnerability. The neediness they criticized in you reveals itself as their own desperate hunger for validation, disguised as superiority. Your healing becomes a cruel mirror, reflecting back to them all the aspects of themselves they have spent years, perhaps decades, avoiding. This is why your transformation feels to them like abandonment, like betrayal, like the cruelest of deaths. The false god they created through your suffering is indeed dying, and with it, their entire sense of identity, their whole understanding of who they are in relation to the world. They are being forced into the very individuation process they have spent so much energy avoiding. And they experience this not as an opportunity for growth, but as an assault upon their very existence. You may find yourself feeling guilty for this death, for the dissolution of their false divinity. The old patterns of your psyche may whisper that you are being cruel, that you are abandoning them in their hour of need. But this is the voice of the old altar speaking, the internalized priest of the religion of your own diminishment. The truth is far more profound in refusing to continue serving as their false god. You are offering them something far greater, the opportunity to find their own authentic relationship with the divine. to discover their own capacity for genuine selfhood, that the death of the false god is not a tragedy. It is a necessity. It is the clearing away of the elaborate illusions that prevent real intimacy, real connection, real love from taking root. For how can two people truly meet when one exists only as a projection screen for the other's unexamined psychology? How can love flourish when it is built upon the foundation of one person's systematic self-erasure? This death, painful as it may be for all involved, is the birth canal through which authentic relationship might eventually emerge. But first, the false structures must collapse. First, the altar must be dismantled. First, the god must die so that the human being, real, flawed, magnificent, and whole, might finally be born in the ruins of their false divinity. In the ashes of the altar you once provided, something new becomes possible. Not the worship of shadows, but the meeting of souls. Not the projection of unlived life, but the courageous facing of what is real, what is true, what is ultimately sacred in its very humanity. The mirrors we hold up to one another are not made of silver and glass, but of something far more volatile, the untamed contents of the human soul. And in this chamber of reflections, where psyche meets psyche in the dance of relationship, the most ancient drama unfolds, the casting of shadows, the weaving of projections, the desperate attempt to place outside of ourselves what we cannot bear to acknowledge within. You have become, without your knowing consent, a living screen upon which another's disowned self has been painted in broad, accusatory strokes. Every flaw they cannot face in the mirror of their own consciousness, every inadequacy that burns like acid in the depths of their being, every shameful secret that writhes in the darkness of their personal underworld, of this has been lifted from their psyche and placed, with surgical precision, upon the canvas of your existence. This is the serpent of projection, ancient as Eden itself, coiling its way through the corridors of human relationship with the patience of geological time. It is the shadow maker, the deflector, the grand architect of psychological exile. For what the ego cannot bear to own, it must disown. What consciousness cannot illuminate, it must cast into the outer darkness. And you, innocent vessel of their internal weather, have become the repository of their rejected gold. But understand this: projection is not merely psychological sleight of hand. It is the ego's most sophisticated defense against the terror of to see oneself clearly, to witness the full spectrum of one's being, the light and the dark, the noble and the base, the divine and the demonic. This requires a courage that few possess. It is easier, far easier, to paint these unwanted aspects onto another's being and then to rage against them there, where they feel safely distant from the self. The narcissist sees their grandiosity reflected in your confidence and calls it arrogance. The coward sees their fear mirrored in your caution and names it weakness. The one who has abandoned their own heart sees your emotional availability and declares it neediness. They have taken the very qualities that would heal them if owned and integrated, and transformed them into weapons against you, into evidence of your unworthiness, into justification for their withdrawal of love. This is the alchemy of projection. Base metal of self-rejection, transformed into the false gold of righteous judgment. They become the pure ones, the enlightened ones, the ones who see clearly, while you carry the burden of their disavowed darkness. You become the problem, the dysfunction, the source of all relational discord. The serpent has successfully shed its skin, leaving you wrapped in the discarded scales of their self-hatred. But projection is not a one-way street. It is a collaborative dance. though one partner may be unconscious of the choreography. For projection to take hold, there must be a hook upon which to hang the disowned content. There must be some resonance, some echo, some thread of connection between the projected material and the psyche receiving it. The narcissist cannot successfully project their grandiosity onto someone who has no relationship to power. The wounded child cannot cast their abandonment fears onto someone who has never tasted rejection. You have become the perfect screen, not because you are flawed, but because you possess the very qualities they have spent a lifetime disowning. Your empathy becomes their oversight. Your boundaries become their coldness. Your growth becomes their instability. Your authenticity becomes their drama. They see in you the parts of themselves they murdered long ago in the name of survival, and now they must destroy these qualities in you to maintain the integrity of their false self. This is the cruel genius of psychological projection. It seeks out its own reflection with the accuracy of a heat-seeking missile. The very qualities that make you capable of deep relationship, of authentic connection, of emotional truth, become the targets of their disowned rage. They are not fighting you. They are fighting the ghost of their own unlived life, the specter of their own abandoned authenticity, the shadow of their own unexpressed soul. The projector becomes trapped in a hole of mirrors, seeing their own reflection everywhere but recognizing it nowhere. They rage against their own face, worn by another. They flee from their own heart, beating in someone else's chest. They attack their own vulnerability wherever it dares to show itself in the world of relationship. The very thing they need most, integration of their shadow, reclamation of their projections, encounter with their authentic self, becomes the very thing they fight against most fiercely, and you, recipient of their psychological exile, begin to carry what was never yours to carry. Their self-hatred becomes your doubt. Their abandonment becomes your fear of intimacy. Their rage becomes your walking on eggshells. Their emptiness becomes your desperate attempts to fill an unfillable void. You begin to see yourself through the distorted lens of their projections, to question your own reality, to doubt your own perceptions, to shrink yourself down to fit the container of their limitations. But here is where the ancient wisdom whispers its truth. Projection always returns home. The serpent, no matter how far it travels, no matter how many gardens it inhabits, no matter how many souls it wraps itself around, must always return to its place of origin. For projection is not the removal of shadow, it is merely the temporary displacement of it. The disowned content remains connected to its source by invisible threads, and these threads, over time, begin to pull. Your healing becomes the catalyst for this return journey, as you begin to see clearly, to distinguish between what is yours and what belongs to another, to refuse to carry the burden of their disowned material. The projections begin to lose their grip. The screen begins to clear. The mirror begins to reflect back to its proper owner. The serpent, finding no place to rest in your psyche, begins its long journey home. This is not a gentle process. The return of projections is often violent, chaotic, filled with the rage of a psyche forced to confront what it has spent years avoiding. They may increase their attacks, may double down on their projections, may gather others to support their version of reality. For the ego does not willingly reclaim its shadow. It fights against integration with the fury of something facing annihilation. But the psyche seeks wholeness with a force stronger than the ego's resistance. What has been disowned wants to be reclaimed. What has been exiled wants to come home. What has been projected wants to be integrated. The serpent of projection, no matter how comfortable it has become in foreign territory, belongs in its own garden, nested in the unconscious of the one who birthed it. Your refusal to remain the repository of their disowned content forces a crisis of consciousness. They must either face their own shadow or find a new screen upon which to project it. They must either reclaim their exiled parts or continue the endless game of psychological hot potato, passing that unwanted material from person to person, relationship to relationship, generation to generation. Some will choose the path of reclamation. They will feel the fire of their returning projections, will taste the bitter medicine of subfincanta, will walk through the valley of integration with courage and humility. They will discover that what they projected onto you was not your darkness but their unlived light, not your flaws but their disowned gifts, not your inadequacy but their abandoned authenticity. Others will choose continued exile. They will find new screens, new repositories, new victims for their psychological displacement. They will continue the ancient pattern, the tired dance, the unconscious ritual of shadow casting. They will remain prisoners of their own projections, seeing themselves everywhere but recognizing themselves nowhere. But you who have served as the unwitting screen for another's internal drama, you are no longer bound by their projections. You are free to see yourself clearly, to own what is truly yours and release what never belonged to you. You are free to love your own shadow, to embrace your own complexity, to dance with your own contradictions without needing another to carry the weight of your disowned material. The serpent has returned home, and in its absence, you discover the true landscape of your soul, not the distorted terrain painted by another's projections, but the authentic geography of your being, with all its valleys and mountains, its fertile ground and its necessary deserts, its light and its darkness, its humanness and its divinity, finally, fully, and forever your own. In the hidden chambers of your being, where the great work of transformation has always unfolded in silence, something extraordinary begins to stir. For so long, you have stood at the furnace of relationship as the eternal alchemist's assistant, feeding your own essence into fires that belonged to another. Your tears became their mercury, your devotion their sulfur, your very life force the prima materia from which their dreams took shape. You learned to distill your pain into their pleasure, to transmute your darkness into their light, to sacrifice your becoming upon the altar of their perpetual remaining. This was the ancient contract, written in invisible ink across your heart, that you would forever be the vessel, never the transformation itself. You were the crucible that held that process, the retort that captured their essence, the philosopher's stone that turned their base experiences into gold while remaining forever unchanged yourself. In this sacred laboratory of love, you believed your highest calling was to dissolve, again and again, so that another might crystallize into wholeness. But the psyche follows laws older than any human arrangement, deeper than any unconscious agreement between souls. Jung knew this mystery well, that individuation cannot be stopped, only delayed, only redirected through the labyrinthine passages of projection and denial. Like water finding its way through stone, the self eventually carves its own channel toward consciousness, regardless of how many times we dam its flow in service of another's thirst. The moment arrives not with fanfare, but with the quiet authority of dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you knew. You wake one morning and something fundamental has shifted in the apparatus of your being. The old formulas no longer work. where once you would automatically reach for the familiar tools of self-sacrifice, the mortar and pestle of your own grinding, the alembic of your own distillation, your hands pause in midair. Something new stirs in the depths of your laboratory, something that belongs entirely to you. This is the great reversal that terrifies those who have grown fat on your negredo, who have built their sense of self upon the steady stream of gold that flowed from your willing dissolution. For they sense, with the primitive wisdom of parasites, that their host is undergoing a metamorphosis that will leave them starving in the wilderness of their own undeveloped souls. You begin to notice the weight of your own prima as burden, but as potential. The raw material of your pain, your confusion, your seemingly endless capacity for suffering, suddenly reveals itself not as evidence of your brokenness, but as the very substance from which your own philosopher's stone will emerge. The lead of your wounds contains its own transmutational fire. The mercury of your tears carries the genetic code of your liberation. In the great work of alchemy, there is a moment called the conjunction, the sacred marriage between opposites that gives birth to something entirely new. For too long, you believed this union must occur between yourself and another, that your completion required their participation, their approval, their presence in your vessel. But now you begin to understand the deeper mystery. The conjunction occurs within, between your conscious self and the dark wisdom of your unconscious depths, between your wounded human nature and your eternal, unbreakable essence. You begin your own opus, contra naturam, the work against nature, against the natural tendency to flow outward in service of another's becoming. You seal your vessel and begin to heat your own material with the fire of your attention. At first, the process feels selfish, foreign, almost blasphemous. You have been so accustomed to the role of facilitator that becoming the subject of your own transformation feels like a violation of some cosmic order. But this is merely the resistance of the old self, the death throes of the identity that defined itself through service to another's incompleteness. The ego that found meaning in being needed, purpose in being used, love in being consumed. This false self must die so that your authentic nature can be born from its ashes. As you tend your own alchemical fires, something unprecedented begins to happen in the relational field around you. Those who depended on your automatic dissolution suddenly find themselves facing the terrifying prospect of their own inner work. The one who fed on your processed gold, while contributing only their raw chaos, suddenly confronts the poverty of their own laboratory. They have no tools for transformation because they never needed to develop them. They have no skill in distillation because your essence was always freely given, already refined, already pure. The horror in their eyes is not malice, but genuine panic, the panic of a child discovering that the breast has dried up, that the source of nourishment they took for granted has suddenly, inexplicably, withdrawn its flow. They rage not from cruelty but from terror, from the sudden recognition that they must now face the negredo of their own unprocessed material without your assistance, without your willing sacrifice to ease their passage. This is the moment when the projection begins to reverse its flow, where once they saw you as the source of problems to be solved, difficulties to be managed, emotional complexity to be endured. They now confront the terrifying possibility that perhaps they were not the stable center around which your chaos orbited. Perhaps they were not the gold to your lead, the solution to your problem, the wisdom to your confusion. As your own alchemical process deepens, you begin to extract meanings from experiences that once seemed meaningless, to find wisdom in wounds. they dismissed as weakness, to discover light in the very darkness they could not tolerate within themselves. You learn to work with your prima materia, not as something to be quickly transformed and given away, but as sacred substance, deserving of patience, attention, and reverence. The calcination burns away what is not essential. The dissolution separates what is true from what was merely familiar. The distillation purifies your understanding, dropping by precious drop. The coagulation crystallizes new forms of being that belong entirely to you. Each stage of your great work produces its own treasures that cannot be borrowed, strengths that cannot be given away. Wisdom that emerges only from the marriage of your suffering with your love. And in this laboratory of self-becoming, you discover the most profound reversal of all, that you were never the base metal you believed yourself to be. You were always the philosopher's stone, disguised as lead to protect yourself from those who would use your transmutational power without understanding its source. Your capacity to transform pain into wisdom, chaos into order, darkness into light. This was never meant to be spent on another's becoming while your own remained forever deferred. The one who once stood confidently in the role of spiritual teacher, emotional guide, psychological superior, now watches in bewildered silence as you demonstrate mastery over mysteries they never bothered to explore. They see you extracting gold from the very experiences they dismissed as worthless, finding meaning in the depths they refused to enter, emerging from crucibles they lacked the courage to approach. This is the Enantiodromia Jung wrote about, the tendency of all psychological energy to eventually flow toward its opposite. Where once the current of transformation flowed from you to them, it now gathers in the vessel of your own becoming. Where once you were the servant of their individuation, you now become the author of your own. Where once you dissolved as they might crystallize, you now coagulate into forms of being that require no external validation, no other's participation, no one's permission but your own. The laboratory grows quiet around this work. The one who once filled it with that demands for your attention, that claims on your energy, their insistence that you'll process, serve, that comfort, now finds themselves strangely excluded from the sacred operation unfolding in your depths. They cannot interrupt what they cannot understand, cannot derail what they were never qualified to direct. In this silence, your true work begins. Not the false opus of transforming yourself to fit another's vision, but the authentic labor of discovering what remains when all the projections fall away, when all the borrowed purposes dissolve, when all the external validators withdraw their recognition. In this blessed emptiness, you meet yourself as you truly aren't base metal to be refined for another's benefit, but the philosopher's stone that was always hidden within the lead of your seeming inadequacy. The reversal is complete, not when they finally see your worth for their recognition was always a poor substitute for your own, but when you no longer need the reflection of yourself in their eyes to know who you are, when you can work in the laboratory of your own becoming without audience, without applause, without the consolation prize of their amazement at your transformation. This is the ultimate alchemical achievement, to become both the base material and the transforming fire, both the question and the answer, both the vessel and the precious substance it contains. To discover that the great work was never about creating gold for others to spend, but about recognizing the inherent nobility of your own elemental nature, the inherent perfection of your own unfolding process. In this recognition, the sacred laboratory of relationship transforms as well. No longer the site of your willing sacrifice to another's incompleteness. It becomes a space where two complete alchemists might meet, each tending their own fires, each responsible for their own transmutation, each offering not their unprocessed wounds for the other to heal, but the refined gold of their own heart-won wisdom. But whether such meeting occurs matters less than the revolution that has taken place within your own being. You have reversed the flow of the great work. You have reclaimed your role as the active agent of your own transformation. You have discovered that the Philosopher's Stone was never something to be created, but something to be remembered, something to be uncovered, something to be, finally, gratefully, courageously claimed as your own. In the secret architecture of the narcissist's mind stands a palace made entirely of crystalline fantasy walls, of spun glass that shimmer with impossible light, towers that reach toward heavens of their own imagining, corridors that echo with the sound of eternal applause. This is not a metaphor, but a living reality, as real to them as flesh and bone, as necessary as breath itself. For within these translucent walls, they are not merely human but divine, not flawed but flawless, not mortal but eternal. You have been the most essential element of this palace, simultaneously the audience in the grand theater, and the very stage upon which their magnificence could be displayed. Every room was designed with you in mind, every mirror positioned to catch your admiring gaze, every echo chamber calibrated to amplify your praise back to them in symphonies of validation. You were not just a visitor to their fantasy, you were its co-creator, its sustaining force, its living foundation. This crystalline kingdom operates according to laws that defy the physics of ordinary reality. Here, their failures transform into triumphs through the alchemy of your belief. Their cruelties become kindnesses when reflected in your forgiving eyes. Their emptiness fills with substance borrowed from your fullness. The palace feeds on your energy, your attention, your willingness to suspend disbelief and enter into their grand delusion as both worshipper and sacrifice. But crystalline structures, for all their beauty, carry within them a fundamental vulnerability. They are magnificent precisely because they are fragile, stunning because they exist in defiance of natural law. The slightest vibration, the smallest shift in temperature, the gentlest touch of reality can send cracks racing through their perfect walls like lightning frozen in glass. Your healing is that touch of reality. It begins as whisper soft as a feather landing on crystal, but its effects are seismic. The first crack appears when you cease to applaud their performance with the desperate enthusiasm they require. The second, when you stop offering your pain as proof of their power. The third, when you begin to question not their version of events, but your own participation in maintaining their illusion. Within the palace, alarms begin to sound, not audible ones, but the deep cellular panic that occurs when the very foundation of existence starts to shift. They feel it before they understand it, this trembling in the walls of their reality. Something is wrong with that perfect world, but they cannot locate the source of the disturbance. They check and recheck their mirrors, polish their performances to an even brighter shine, increase the volume of their grandiose pronouncements. But still, the trembling continues. The truth is that you were never merely an audience member in their theater of self-aggrandizement. You were the theater itself, the walls that contained their performance, the stage that supported their dance, the lights that illuminated their glory. Your consciousness was the space within which their fantasy could unfold, your emotional responses the very air their full self breathed. Without your participation, their entire world becomes insubstantial. Like trying to perform Shakespeare in a vacuum. As you heal, as you begin the sacred work of reclaiming your own authentic being. You start to withdraw the psychic energy that has been feeding that crystal palace for so long. This is not a conscious act of revenge or rebellion. It is simply the natural result of turning your attention inward, toward your own neglected soul. But to them, it feels like the ultimate betrayal, as if the earth itself has decided to stop supporting the sky. The fantasy they have constructed is more than a simple delusion. It is a complete cosmology, a universe with its own physics, its own gods, its own meaning. In this universe, they are the central star around which all other bodies orbit. You have been their most faithful planet, maintaining your devoted revolution around their burning ego. Your entire existence defined by your relationship to their light. When you begin to heal, you start to develop your own gravitational pull, your own source of illumination, and that carefully ordered solar system begins to destabilize. Jung understood that the psyche abhors a vacuum. When the persona, the carefully constructed mask we show the world, begins to crack, what lies beneath demands recognition. For most of us, this is terrifying enough. This confrontation with our own shadow, our own imperfections and contradictions. But for the narcissist, what lies beneath the crystal palace is not merely imperfection, but a howling void. An absence so complete it threatens to swallow them entirely. They have built their palace, not on solid ground but suspended over this abyss, held aloft by the collective belief of those who participate in their fantasy. You have been the chief architect of this impossible construction, your faith serving as both foundation and flying buttress. When you withdraw your belief, when you cease to be impressed by their manufactured magnificence, the palace begins its inevitable descent toward the void they have spent lifetimes avoiding. The collapse does not happen all at once. Crystal breaks in patterns, following lines of stress and weakness that have been building for years. First, hairline fractures appear in the walls, where your admiration once provided reinforcement. Then larger cracks begin to spider across the perfect surfaces, each one corresponding to a moment when you fail to provide the expected response. When you choose your own healing over their need for validation, they try desperately to repair the damage, to restore the palace to its former glory. They may increase their demands for your attention, amplify their performances to impossible heights, or attempt to recruit new audience members to replace your withdrawing energy. But once the fundamental structure has been compromised, these efforts only accelerate the collapse. Each desperate gesture creates new stress points, new opportunities for reality to intrude upon that carefully maintained illusion, the hammer of reality that shatters their glass. Kingdom is not wielded by your hand, but by your simple refusal to continue living within their fantasy. Your healing becomes an act of architecture, not the building of something new, but the patient dismantling of something false. You are not attacking that palace. You are simply stepping outside its walls and discovering that the world beyond is not only real but beautiful in ways their crystalline prison could never be. As the walls come tumbling down, they are forced to confront what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism by which opposites are reconciled and new consciousness is born. But this requires a willingness to embrace paradox, to hold the tension between what one wishes to be and what one actually is. The narcissist, schooled in the art of avoiding such tensions, finds themselves paralyzed by this prospect. In the ruins of their crystal palace, they must face the barren landscape of their actual self, not the magnificent deity they have pretended to be, but the wounded human being they have spent lifetimes avoiding. This landscape is not inherently barren, but it appears so to eyes accustomed to the glittering artifice of fantasy. where they expect to find the lush gardens of their imagined perfection, they discover only the raw soil of authentic existence, waiting to be cultivated with the patient work of genuine self-love. But this work, this slow, humble tending of the actual self requires tools they have never learned to use. It demands the ability to be ordinary, to be flawed, to be human in the most fundamental sense. It asks them to find worth not in comparison to others or in the worship of admirers, but in the simple fact of being alive, conscious, capable of growth. This is a language they do not speak, a currency they have never valued. The collapse of their fantasy is simultaneously their greatest catastrophe and their greatest opportunity. In the wreckage of their crystal palace lies the raw material for a different kind of structure, not a monument to their imagined perfection, but a simple dwelling where their authentic self might finally take root and grow. But this construction requires skills they have never developed: humility, patience, self-compassion, and the willingness to be seen as they truly are, rather than as they wish to be perceived. Your healing has not destroyed them, it has simply revealed the destruction that was always there, hidden beneath the glittering surface of their fantasy. The palace was always doomed to fall because it was built on impossible foundations, sustained by borrowed energy, maintained through the exploitation of others' willingness to believe in beautiful lies. Your recovery is not the cause of their collapse, but merely the moment when the inevitable could no longer be postponed in your wholeness. They see reflected back to them the possibility of genuine reconstruction, not the rebuilding of their crystal palace, but the patient work of creating something real, something sustainable, something that does not require the sacrifice of others to maintain its beauty. But this possibility terrifies them more than the collapse itself, for it demands a kind of death they are not prepared to die, the death of the full self that has been their only known identity. In the deepest chambers of the narcissistic psyche, beneath the gleaming armor of grandiosity and the towering monuments to self-importance, there dwells a terror so ancient, so primal, that it would make even Dante pause in his descent through the circles of hell. It is the terror of complete abandonment, merely the fear of being left alone in a room, but the existential horror of being left alone with oneself, naked before the mirror of reality, stripped of all the elaborate costumes and performances that have kept the authentic self hidden even from its own recognition. This terror is not born in adulthood. It is the fossilized scream of a child who learned too early that love was conditional, that acceptance required performance, that their very existence was a burden too great for others to bear without compensation. Somewhere in that primordial past, they made a covenant with survival itself. I will be anything, everything, spectacular and shining, if only you will not leave me here in this darkness with the truth of what I am. And so they became gods of their own making, architects of illusion, masters of the grand performance that would ensure no one could ever see deeply enough to discover the profound emptiness that haunts their core. The grandiosity you have witnessed, the inflation that seemed so solid, so unshakable, is actually the most fragile of constructions, a cathedral built upon the quicksand of terror, held together by the adhesive of others' participation in their psychological drama. You were never loved by them in the way that souls recognize and celebrate other souls. You were recruited, conscripted into the elaborate theater of their survival. Your role was both sacred and terrible, to be the witness to their magnificence, the mirror that reflected back their constructed godhood, the faithful congregation that gave meaning to their endless sermons of self-importance. Without your participation, without your presence in the front row of their one-person show, They are forced to confront the devastating possibility that the stage is empty. The audience has left, and they are performing for no one but the echoing chambers of their own hollow heart. When you begin to heal, when you start to withdraw your energy from their psychological theater, they experience what Jung called the night seed journey, that archetypal descent into the depths of the unconscious, where the hero must face the monsters of the deep, the shadow creatures that have been banished from conscious awareness. But here lies the crucial difference between the genuine hero's journey and the narcissist's experience of abandonment. The hero chooses the descent, embraces the darkness as a necessary passage toward wholeness. The narcissist experiences your withdrawal not as an invitation to their own heroic journey, but as evidence of the cosmic rejection they have spent their entire existence trying to avoid. Your healing becomes, in their distorted perception, the ultimate abandonment. Not the abandonment of your physical presence, though they may desperately cling to that as well, but something far more threatening: the abandonment of your participation in their psychological drama, when you refuse to dance their dance of dysfunction. When you stop playing your assigned role in their elaborate performance, you are not simply leaving them. You are dismantling the very stage upon which their constructed identity depends. Imagine, if you will, the terror of an actor who has spent so many years in character that they have forgotten their own face beneath the makeup. When you withdraw, you're witnessing your participation, your reflection of their grandiose self-image. You are essentially removing the mirror in which they have been seeing themselves. Suddenly, they are faced with the prospect of existing without an audience, without validation, without the constant external confirmation that they are indeed the magnificent being they have claimed to be. This is why your wholeness becomes their evidence of cosmic rejection. Your integration, your growing self-awareness, your increasing ability to see through their illusions and refuse to participate in them, all of this represents to them not your growth, but their abandonment. In their distorted logic, your healing is not a gift you give to yourself, but a punishment you inflict upon them. Your clarity becomes their confusion, your boundaries their rejection, your self-love their evidence that you have stopped loving them. But beneath this interpretation lies the deeper terror. If you can see through their performance, if you can withdraw your energy from their drama, if you can love yourself enough to refuse participation in your own diminishment, then perhaps others can too, perhaps will too, perhaps already have. Your healing becomes the first domino in what they perceive as an inevitable cascade toward total abandonment, complete exposure, ultimate rejection. The narcissist cannot comprehend that your withdrawal is not about them at all. It is about you, about your own journey toward wholeness, about your own sacred relationship with your authentic self. They cannot fathom that your healing is not a rejection of them, but an affirmation of yourself, because their entire psychological structure is built upon the premise that everything that happens in their orbit is fundamentally about them. Your individuation process becomes, in their perception, a deliberate act of abandonment, a cruel withdrawal of the life force they have been drawing from your participation in their illusion. This terror of abandonment manifests in ways both subtle and dramatic. They may rage against your healing, attempting to convince you that your growth is actually selfishness, that your boundaries are cruelty, that your self-care is abandonment. They may attempt to guilt you back into the familiar dance, reminding you of all the ways they need you, all the reasons why your withdrawal will cause them unbearable pain. They may threaten to abandon you first, to beat you to the punch of rejection before you can inflict upon them the ultimate wound of seeing who they really are, or they may attempt to seduce you back into the drama with promises of change, with temporary modifications of their behavior that seem to suggest they are finally ready to meet you in the realm of authentic relationship. But watch carefully, these are not genuine transformations, but strategic adaptations, not evolution, but camouflage. The core terror remains unchanged. They would rather die than be truly seen, truly known, truly faced with the reality of their own humanity. Jung understood that the night sea journey is not optional for those who would become whole. The descent into the unconscious, the facing of the shadow, the integration of the rejected aspects of self, these are the necessary passages through which consciousness is born. But the narcissist, trapped in their terror of abandonment, cannot voluntarily enter these dark waters. They stand at the shore of their own unconscious, paralyzed by the fear that if they dive deep enough, they will discover that there is nothing there but the abandoned child. They have spent their entire life trying to escape. Your wholeness terrifies. Then, because it represents everything they cannot allow themselves to become: authentic, vulnerable, real. Your integration is their disintegration, not because you have caused it, but because your very existence as a whole human being illuminates the fragmented nature of their own psyche. You have become living proof that the night sea journey is survivable, that one can face the depths and emerge not destroyed but transformed. And so they experience your healing as the cruelest of abandonments. You have abandoned their version of reality, their carefully constructed mythology, their elaborate defense against the terror of being truly known. You have committed the ultimate betrayal. You have chosen truth over their illusion, wholeness over their fragmentation, your authentic self over their projected fantasy of who you should be. In their terror, they cannot see that your departure from their psychological drama is not an abandonment, but an invitation for them to begin their own hero's journey, to face their own night sea journey, to discover that beneath the terror of abandonment lies not the emptiness they fear, but the authentic self they have been hiding from all along. But this invitation requires a courage they may never possess. The courage to be truly alone with themselves long enough to discover who they really are. Until they find that courage, your wholeness will remain their wound, your healing their evidence of cosmic rejection. Your love for yourself, their proof that love itself has abandoned them forever. In the deepest chambers of the human psyche, where memory dissolves into myth and personal history merges with archetypal truth, there exists a wound so fundamental that it shapes the very architecture of consciousness itself. This is not the kind of wound that bleeds and scabs and heals with time's patient ministrations. This is the wound that cannot heal, not because it is too deep, not because it is too old, but because it has been rendered invisible to the one who carries it. At the narcissist's core lies this primordial injury, this original separation from the authentic self that occurred so early in their development that it feels less like a traumatic event and more like the natural order of existence. It is the wound of a soul that learned, before it could even speak, that its true nature was not welcome in the world, that its genuine feelings were too much, too little, too inconvenient for the caregivers upon whom survival depended. That love was conditional, connection was performance, and safety required the construction of a false self so convincing that eventually even its creator forgot it was a fabrication. This wound predates language, predates conscious memory, predates the formation of the ego itself. It exists in the realm of the body's knowing, in the nervous system's ancient wisdom, in the soul's cellular memory of paradise lost. It is the wound of the child who discovered that being real meant being rejected, that showing authentic need meant facing abandonment, that the price of love was the murder of the true self. But here lies the cruel paradox that defines the narcissistic condition. The very wound that cries out most desperately for healing is the wound that cannot be acknowledged to exist. For to see the wound clearly would require them to face the truth of their constructed identity. To admit the existence of the authentic self they believed they had to sacrifice. To feel the full weight of a grief so vast it threatens to dissolve the carefully maintained edifice of their false persona, and so they live in a state of psychological, suspended animation. Frozen at the moment of original injury, unable to move forward because they cannot look back, unable to heal because they cannot feel, unable to grow because they cannot grieve. The wound remains fresh beneath the surface, bleeding invisibly into every relationship, every interaction, every moment of contact with authentic life. Your healing becomes the moonlight that illuminates this grave they have tried so hard to keep hidden, even from themselves. As you begin to metabolize your own pain, to transform your suffering into wisdom, to alchemize your wounds into sources of compassion and strength, you become a living reminder of what they cannot access, not because they lack the capacity, but because they cannot acknowledge the need. Every step you take toward integration becomes a mirror reflecting their own stagnation. Every breakthrough in your self-awareness highlights their own self-deception. Every moment of your authentic emotional expression illuminates the desert of their inner emotional landscape. You are healing in ways they cannot even conceptualize, growing in directions they have forbidden themselves to explore, accessing depths of being they have convinced themselves do not exist. This is why your transformation becomes their torment. Not because they are inherently evil, not because they wish you ill from some place of pure malice, but because your healing threatens the very foundation of their psychological survival strategy. You are proof that the authentic self they murdered was not actually dangerous, that the feelings they buried were not actually toxic, that the vulnerability they abandoned was not actually weakness. Your journey toward wholeness becomes an indictment of their choice to remain fragmented. Your willingness to feel deeply challenges their commitment to emotional numbness. Your capacity to grieve your losses highlights their inability to mourn what they have sacrificed. Your growing self-compassion illuminates their relationship with self-hatred. Your expanding consciousness reflects their contracted awareness. The wound that cannot heal is not just a personal tragedy, it is a relational catastrophe. For the narcissist cannot give what they do not possess, cannot offer what they have never received, cannot provide the very healing presence that their wounded inner child desperately craves. They become both the abandoned child and the abandoning parent, caught in an endless loop of self-rejection that plays out across every relationship they enter. They seek healing through conquest rather than surrender, through dominance rather than vulnerability, through the consumption of others' life force rather than the cultivation of their own inner resources. They mistake intensity for intimacy, control for connection, admiration for love. They collect relationships like trophies, hoping that external validation might somehow fill the void where self-acceptance should reside. But no amount of external supply can heal an internal wound. No accumulation of praise can restore a rejected authentic self. No collection of conquered hearts can mend the original heartbreak. The wound that cannot heal remains immune to all the medications the false self prescribes: admiration, control, perfection, superiority. These are bandages applied to invisible injuries, painkillers administered for pain that cannot be acknowledged to exist. Meanwhile, You who have learned to face your wounds directly, to breathe with your pain rather than against it, to meet your shadows with curiosity rather than judgment, to discover that the very process of acknowledging injury begins the mysterious alchemy of healing. Not the healing that erases scars, but the healing that transforms them into sources of wisdom. Not the healing that returns you to some imagined state of original innocence, but the healing that integrates all parts of your experience into a more complex and compassionate wholeness. Your willingness to feel your feelings fully allows them to move through you rather than remaining trapped within you. Your capacity to grieve your losses prevents them from calcifying into permanent wounds. Your practice of self-compassion creates the internal environment where authentic healing can occur. You discover that the only way out of emotional pain is through it, that the only way to heal a wound is first to acknowledge its existence. This is what the narcissist cannot bear to witness: not your pain, which they can dismiss or minimize, but your healing, which they cannot explain away. Your transformation stands as living proof that another way is possible, that the prison of the false self is not the only option, that the wound of original separation need not be a life sentence of emotional exile, but they remain trapped in their own psychological amber, preserved at the moment of original injury, unable to metabolize the very experiences that could free them. They watch your growth with a mixture of fascination and horror, drawn to the authenticity they sacrificed, yet terrified of the vulnerability required to reclaim it. They want what you have, but cannot pay the price you have paid the price of truth, of feeling, of genuine self-encounter. The wound that cannot heal becomes a fault line running through every aspect of their existence. It shapes their relationships, their career choices, their internal dialogue, their relationship with time itself. They live in a perpetual present, unable to grieve the past or imagine a different future. They exist in a state of chronic emergency, always defending against threats that originated decades ago, always preparing for abandonment that already occurred. And yet, beneath the layers of defense and denial, beneath the elaborate construction of the full self, the wound continues to pulse with its own life. It remembers what was lost. It carries the blueprint of what could be restored. It holds the memory of the original authentic self that was sacrificed on the altar of survival. The wound that cannot heal is also the wound that contains within itself the seeds of its own redemption, if only it could be seen, acknowledged, felt, and grieved. Your healing illuminates this possibility, like dawn breaking over a landscape. They have convinced themselves was permanently shrouded in darkness. You are proof that wounds can be transformed, that authenticity can be reclaimed, that the full self is not the only option for survival. You are the living demonstration that the price of genuine healing, however high, is worth paying. But they remain frozen at the threshold, unable to step forward into the unknown territory of authentic selfhood, unable to step backward into the familiar territory of unconsciousness. They are caught between RLDS witnesses to your transformation, yet unable to begin their own, carriers of a wound so ancient it has become their identity, guardians of a pain so fundamental they cannot imagine existing without it. The wound that cannot heal remains their most treasured possession and their greatest prison, the source of their deepest suffering and their strongest defense against change. And you, walking your own path toward wholeness, can only shine your light and trust that somewhere in their darkness, something still remembers what it feels like to be real in the darkest chambers of the narcissistic psyche, where wounded grandiosity meets abysmal emptiness. There dwells a God that feeds not on worship but on its absence, not on creation but on destruction, not on love but on the bitter nectar of what can never be possessed. This is the envious god, the shadow deity that presides over a temple built from resentment, whose only sacrament is the destruction of what it cannot become. You have unknowingly become the most sacred object in this twisted pantheon, not because you are loved, but because you represent everything this god can never claim as its own. Your healing is their holy grail, your peace their most coveted treasure, your joy the golden fleece they would steal if only they could discover the secret of its making. But herein lies the terrible paradox of envy. It is not desire in the sense of wanting to create or achieve, but the darker impulse to unmake what exists beyond one's reach. The envious god does not seek to build altars of its own. It seeks only to topple yours. It does not light candles in darkness. It blows out every flame it encounters, as if your light somehow diminishes the possibility of its own illumination. This is the psychology of the zero-sum universe, where your gain becomes their loss, where your healing becomes evidence of their fundamental unworthiness, where your very existence becomes a judgment upon their emptiness. Watch how they consume themselves in the flames of their own bitter observation, like Tantalus, forever reaching for fruit that retreats from his grasp. They feast their eyes upon your transformation while starving their souls on the knowledge that such metamorphosis remains beyond their comprehension. They study your healing with the desperate intensity of alchemists trying to reverse engineer gold, not understanding that the philosopher's stone cannot be stolen, only earned through the labor of one's own dissolution and reconciliation. In their secret moments, when the mask of superiority slips and the raw wound of inadequacy bleeds through, they prostrate themselves before the altar of your becoming. They memorize every detail of your journey, not as students seeking to learn, but as thieves casing a vault they can never crack. They catalog your insights, your breakthroughs, your moments of grace, hoping to discover some external formula. They might appropriate some technique they might plagiarize, some shortcut that might deliver them into the promised land of your inner peace. But envy is the most corrosive of emotions, precisely because it reveals the impossibility of its own fulfillment. The envious god knows, with the terrible clarity of the damned, that what you have achieved cannot be simply transferred or stolen. Your healing emerged from your willingness to descend into your own underworld, to face your own monsters, to die to your own false selves. It was born from the marriage of your suffering with your courage, from the alchemical wedding of your darkness with your light. They see the gold but refuse to acknowledge the furnace. They covet the butterfly but reject the chrysalis. They desire the dawn but will not endure the night. And in this refusal lies their eternal punishment to remain forever on the threshold of transformation, pressing their faces against the glass of your inner sanctuary, while refusing to do the work that would grant them entry into sanctuaries of their own. The envious god's worship takes the form of persecution. Unable to possess your peace, they seek to shatter it. Unable to claim your joy, they attempt to poison it with doubt, with criticism, with the subtle implication that happiness itself is somehow suspect, shallow, naive. They become archaeologists of your past, excavating every mistake, every moment of weakness, every shadow you have faced and integrated, wielding these discoveries like weapons against your present wholeness. Remember when you were broken, like me, their eyes seem to say. Remember when you were lost, confused, desperate, damaged. How dare you forget? How dare you heal? How dare you find peace when I remain in torment? They become the guardians of your former self, insisting that you remain loyal to the identity that once made them feel superior by comparison. This is the envious God's most insidious prayer, that you might fall back into the pit from which you emerged, not because it would serve any constructive purpose, but simply because your continued ascension becomes too painful for them to witness. They would rather see you drowning alongside them than swimming free in waters they dare not enter. The projection becomes their liturgy. Every quality they despise in themselves, they discover in you. Every wound they refuse to heal, they insist you still carry. Every shadow they will not acknowledge, they cast upon your light. Your healing becomes, in their twisted theology, evidence of your arrogance. Your peace becomes proof of your coldness. Your boundaries become confirmation of your cruelty. Your joy becomes a verification of your superficiality. In the most poisonous moments of their worship, they become evangelical about your imagined failings. They seek converts to their vision of your unworthiness, gathering disciples who will join them in the sacred work of diminishing your light. They form congregations of the envious, where the primary ritual is the meticulous cataloging of reasons why your healing is somehow illegitimate, temporary, or hollow. But observe the terrible exhaustion that eventually overcomes all servants of the envious God, the constant vigilance required to monitor your progress, to search for cracks in your serenity, to document evidence of your imperfection. This becomes a full-time occupation that leaves no energy for their own development. They become professional witnesses to your life, amateur theologians of your experience, unpaid critics of your transformation. In their obsessive attention to your journey, they abandon their own. In their meticulous study of your healing, they neglect their own wounds. In their careful observation of your peace, they cultivate only agitation. They become scholars of a subject they refuse to study personally, experts in a field they will never practice, priests of a God they secretly know they have chosen precisely because it demands no actual devotion, no real sacrifice, no genuine transformation. The envious God promises its followers that they can remain exactly as they are, while still feeling righteous in their resentment. It offers the consolation prize of moral superiority to those who refuse the actual prize of inner work. It provides the comfort of victimhood to those who reject the challenge of heroism. It grants the pleasure of judgment to those who fear the pain of growth. But you begin to recognize this worship for what it truly is, not love, not even hatred in any pure form, but the most desperate kind of spiritual hunger disguised as its opposite. The envious God's rage at your healing is actually the tantrum of a starving soul that has glimpsed food it believes it cannot digest. Their persecution of your peace is actually the thrashing of a drowning person who refuses to learn to swim. Understanding this does not excuse their behavior, but it illuminates its source. The envious God they serve is actually their own undeveloped self, the potential they carry but refuse to nurture, the light they possess but choose to keep buried beneath layers of resentment and self-pity. They worship at the altar of what they might become, while simultaneously sabotaging every opportunity for such becoming. In their envy, they reveal their capacity. In their bitter observation of your transformation, they demonstrate their own hunger for metamorphosis. In their detailed cataloging of your healing, they show their intimate knowledge of what healing looks like. They are, in their twisted way, already students of the very mysteries they claim to despise. But the envious God demands that this learning remain theoretical, that this hunger remain unsatisfied, that this capacity remain undeveloped. It requires its followers to maintain the fiction that transformation is either impossible or meaningless, that peace is either unattainable or empty, that healing is either fake or temporary, and so they remain imprisoned in their temple of resentment, offering their daily sacrifices to a God that grows fat on their diminishment, that feeds on their refusal to claim their own divine inheritance. They burn offerings of their own potential on altars dedicated to the impossibility of change, chanting litanies of limitation, while the very existence of your transformation stands as eternal testimony to the lie they have chosen to live. Yet, even in this darkest form of worship, there remains a seed of hope. For envy, unlike indifference, is at least a form of recognition. The envious God sees your light clearly enough to fear it, understands your peace intimately enough to resent. It recognizes your healing accurately enough to attack it. In their very persecution lies the admission that what you have achieved is real, powerful, unworthy of their desperate attention. The day may come when the hunger that drives their envy finally overcomes the fear that sustains it. The day may arrive when their fascination with your transformation finally outweighs their investment in your healing has actually prepared them for healing of their own. But whether that day comes or not, you must learn to carry your light in the presence of those who worship it through attempted destruction. You must find peace in the knowledge that your healing will always be someone's holy war, your joy someone's jihad, your very existence someone's crisis of faith in the religion of impossibility. The envious God's persecution becomes paradoxically the ultimate validation of your transformation, for nothing confirms the reality of your healing quite like the desperate attempts to deny it. Nothing proves the authenticity of your peace quite like the frantic efforts to disturb it. Nothing demonstrates the power of your light quite like the elaborate shadows cast by those who cannot bear to see it shine. In recognizing this twisted form of worship, you free yourself from the need to defend your healing, to justify your peace, or to dim your light for the comfort of those who have chosen to remain in darkness. You understand that their envy is not your responsibility. Their God is not your deity, and their temple is not your sanctuary. You walk on carrying your light, not as a weapon against their darkness, but as a beacon for any who might finally grow tired of worshiping at the altar of their own impossibility and choose, instead, to begin the real work of transformation in the ancient rituals of atonement. The high priest would select a goat from the flock, not the finest or the most beautiful, but one deemed suitable to carry the sins of the entire community. Upon this creature's head, he would symbolically place all the transgressions, all the failures, all the shadow material that the people could not bear to claim as their own. Then, with solemn ceremony, the goat would be driven into the wilderness, carrying with it the collective darkness, leaving the community feeling purified, cleansed, free from the burden of their own imperfections. You have been their scapegoat. Though no ritual marked your selection, no ceremony acknowledged your sacrifice, the process was more subtle, more insidious, a gradual loading of their sins onto your shoulders, until you bent beneath their weight without even understanding what you carried. Every failure they could not face became your fault. Every inadequacy they could not accept became your deficiency. Every shadow they could not integrate became your darkness to bear. This psychological sleight of hand is perhaps the narcissist's most masterful trick, the ability to transfer their internal chaos onto another person so completely that both parties forget where the original wounds began. They do not consciously choose you as their scapegoat. Rather, they unconsciously seek out those whose empathy runs so deep, whose boundaries are so porous, whose desire to heal and help is so profound that you will naturally absorb what they cannot contain in the ecosystem of their family system, whether bound by blood or created through relationship roles, become as fixed as the positions of planets in orbit. They occupy the center, the sun around which all others revolve, while you are assigned the position of the shadow bearer, the one who exists in darkness, so that their light might appear brighter by contrast. Your role is not merely to be blamed, but to accept that blame so completely that it becomes part of your identity. The insidious beauty of this system is how it masquerades as natural law. Just as water flows downhill, their shame flows toward you. Just as heat rises, their anger ascends from their own failures and descends upon your head. You become the lightning rod for every storm in their psyche, the repository for every emotion they cannot afford to feel, every truth they cannot afford to know. Jung understood that every family, every system, requires what he called the carrier of the projection, someone willing to embody the disowned aspects of the collective unconscious. In healthy systems, this role rotates, shared among members, acknowledged and processed. But in the narcissist's realm, you become the permanent receptacle, the fixed point onto which all their psychological waste is dumped with the regularity of tides. Your childhood, perhaps, was spent learning to read the weather patterns of the emotions, to position yourself perfectly to catch their falling shame before it could land on them, and shatter their carefully maintained self-image. You became fluent in the language of their triggers, expert in the geography of their wounds, devoted to the full-time occupation of managing their internal climate so they never had to face the storms brewing within their own soul. This role consumes you slowly, like radiation poisoning imperceptibly at first. Then, with gathering speed, you begin to feel heavy with sorrows that aren't your own, sick with shames that were never yours to carry, exhausted by battles you never chose to fight. Your own authentic emotions become buried beneath layers of projected material, like sediment accumulating on the ocean floor, until you forget what your natural landscape once looked like. The psychology of scapegoating relies on your willingness to believe that you deserve the treatment you receive, that somehow your very existence creates the problems that plague their perfect world. They reinforce this belief through subtle and not so subtle communications. Sighs that suggest your presence brings heaviness. Silences that imply your words cause discord. Expressions that convey how much easier their life would be without your complicated needs and inconvenient feelings. But scapegoats, in the original ritual, were not destroyed. They were sent into the wilderness. And in that wilderness, something profound could occur. Away from the community that had burdened them with sins not their own, they might discover their true nature, their authentic being, their actual weight without the crushing load of others' unwound shadows. Your healing is precisely this journey into the wilderness, this sacred rebellion that begins not with anger but with a simple, revolutionary question. What if none of this is actually mine to carry? This question is more dangerous to their system than any act of defiance, more threatening than any expression of rage, because it strikes at the very foundation of their psychological economy, the moment you begin to sort your authentic feelings from their projected ones. Their carefully constructed universe begins to wobble on its axis. When you start to return their shame to its rightful owner, when you refuse to absorb their anger like a sponge soaking up spilt wine, when you step away from your position as the family's designated sin-bearer, the entire system faces a crisis that threatens its very existence. This is why your healing feels like betrayal to them, not because you are hurting them, but because you are abandoning your post as their psychological waste management system. For years, decades perhaps, they have been able to maintain their sense of righteousness, their feeling of being perpetually wronged, their identity as the long-suffering victim of your inadequacies. Your recovery dismantles this narrative structure upon which their entire sense of self depends. Without you to blame, they must confront what Jung called the terrible freedom of taking responsibility for their own experience. Every failure that was once your fault must now find its true home in their own choices and actions. Every disappointment that was once evidence of your inadequacy must now be examined as a reflection of their own expectations and demands. Every moment of unhappiness that was once proof of your defectiveness must now be investigated as arising from their own internal landscape. This confrontation with personal responsibility is perhaps the narcissist's deepest terror, more frightening than abandonment, more threatening than exposure. To acknowledge that they are the author of their own suffering would require dismantling not just their current complaints, but the entire mythology of their victimhood, the complete narrative structure that has allowed them to feel simultaneously superior and wronged, powerful and persecuted. Your rebellion threatens to expose the truth that their suffering has always been largely self-created, maintained through their inability to process their own emotions, sustained by their refusal to face their own shadow, perpetuated by their insistence on projecting their internal chaos onto external targets, without you to serve as the explanation for everything wrong in their world. They must face the possibility that the problem was never you at all. The scapegoat's return from the wilderness is always met with resistance from the community that expelled them. Your healing represents not just personal transformation, but systemic disruption. You are no longer available to serve as their emotional dumping ground, no longer willing to accept responsibility for their inner weather, no longer able to be the convenient explanation for their persistent unhappiness. This return threatens to reveal the arbitrariness of your original selection as scapegoat, the complete lack of justice in the sins that were heaped upon your head. If you can heal, if you can find peace, if you can discover your own worth and beauty, then clearly the darkness you were forced to carry was never an inherent part of your nature. This recognition illuminates the cruelty of their system, the unfairness of their projections, the complete fabrication of their justifications for your mistreatment. In laying down their cross, you force them to see it clearly for the first time, not as the natural consequence of your defects, but as the artificial construction of their own unwillingness to face their shadow. The cross was always meant to be temporary, the burden always meant to be returned to its rightful owner. Your healing is simply the completion of an ancient ritual that was interrupted before its natural conclusion, walking back toward your own natural state of wholeness and self-acceptance. Leave behind not just their projections, but the entire worldview that made such projections necessary. You discover that paradise was never lost through your failures, but only obscured by their need to make you responsible for their internal exile from themselves. This return to your authentic nature is simultaneously an act of self-love and an act of mercy toward them, though they may never recognize it as such. By refusing to carry their sins any longer, you offer them the opportunity, terrifying though it may be, to finally face their own wilderness, to encounter their own shadow, to begin their own journey toward the wholeness that can only be achieved through the integration of all they have spent lifetimes disowning. The rebellion of the scapegoat is not an act of vengeance, but an act of liberation, yours first, but potentially theirs as well, if they can find the courage to walk into their own wilderness, and discover what lies beyond the need to blame others for the darkness that has always belonged to them alone. There is a light that emerges from the alchemy of authentic transformation, not the artificial brilliance of spiritual bypassing or the harsh glare of righteous judgment, but something far more profound and threatening to those who have made their home in darkness. It is the gentle radiance of integrated being, the soft luminescence that emanates from a soul that has descended into its own depths, faced its shadow, and emerged not perfect, but whole. This light that now radiates from your being burns their darkness like acid on stone, dissolving the carefully constructed illusions they have spent lifetimes building and maintaining. You carry this light not as a weapon, though they experience it as such, but as the natural consequence of your inner work. It is the light of someone who has learned to love their own broken places, who has made peace with their imperfections, who has integrated the fragments of self that were once scattered across the landscape of their unconscious. This is not the harsh fluorescence of superiority, but the warm glow of self-acceptance, and this, perhaps more than anything else, is what they cannot bear to witness. For in your presence now, they are confronted with something that challenges the very foundation of their existence, the possibility of authentic being. Your integrated wholeness stands as living testimony to the lie they have been telling themselves, that growth is impossible, that change is dangerous, that the shadow must remain forever banished to maintain the illusion of their constructed perfection. Your light illuminates not only your own truth, but theirs as well, and what it reveals in them is not the godlike being they have pretended to be, but the frightened, fragmented human they have spent their existence trying to escape. Like Plato's prisoners in the cave, they have lived so long in the shadowy realm of projections and illusions that they have mistaken the dancing shadows on the wall for reality itself. Your healing has brought you into the sunlight of authentic consciousness, and when you attempt to share this light, when your very presence radiates the truth of what is possible for human beings, they experience it not as liberation but as assault. The light that could free them feels instead like an attack upon their carefully curated underworld. This is the tragedy of the narcissistic condition. They have become so identified with their cave, so attached to their shadows, so invested in their projections, that the very light that could heal them becomes their torment. Your wholeness does not judge them. Judgment requires a sense of superiority, and true healing transcends such dualistic thinking. Instead, your integrated being simply exists, radiates, illuminates, and in doing so, makes visible all the aspects of themselves they have banished to the darkness. Watch how they respond to your light. They may attempt to dim it, to convince you that your radiance is too bright, too overwhelming, too much for ordinary human relationships to bear. They may accuse you of thinking you are better than them, of believing yourself to be enlightened while they remain in darkness. But this accusation reveals more about their own interior landscape than yours. They cannot conceive of light that does not create shadows, of wholeness that does not require the diminishment of others, of self-love that does not necessitate the hatred of those who have not yet found their way to such acceptance. Or they may attempt to blind you to your own luminescence, to convince you that the light you carry is actually darkness, that your healing is actually sickness, that your integration is actually fragmentation. This is the gaslighting of the underworld dweller, the desperate attempt to drag you back into the cave where shadows are easier to manipulate than the clear light of consciousness. They know, on some deep level, that your light threatens their entire world, not because you intend to destroy it, but because its very existence proves that other ways of being are possible. The light of your healing reveals to them the profound loneliness of their existence. While you have learned to be in relationship with all aspects of yourself, the beautiful and the ugly, the strong and the vulnerable, the wise and the foolish, they remain alienated from their own depths, estranged from their own shadow, at war with their own humanity. Your integration makes visible their fragmentation. Your self-compassion illuminates their self-hatred. Your capacity for authentic relationship highlights their isolation within the prison of their own projections. This is why your presence becomes increasingly unbearable to them as your healing deepens. It is not that you have become harsh or judgmental, quite the opposite. It is that you have become real in a way that makes their elaborate performance seem suddenly hollow. Their grandiose presentations appear transparent, their carefully constructed persona reveal itself as the mask it has always been. Your authenticity does not attack their inauthenticity. It simply exists as a living reminder that another way is possible. Jung understood that the self, that archetype of psychological wholeness, radiates a natural authority that cannot be manufactured or performed. It is the authority of someone who has made the journey to their own center and returned with the treasure of integrated being. This is the light that now emanates from your presence, not the borrowed light of external validation or the artificial glow of spiritual materialism, but the indigenous radiance of a soul that has found its way home to itself. To those who have never made this journey, who have never risked the descent into their own unconscious, who have never faced the terror of discovering who they really are beneath all their personas and projections, this light appears threatening, overwhelming, impossible to bear. They experience your wholeness not as an inspiration, but as an indictment, not as a possibility, but as a threat, not as a gift, but as an attack upon their carefully constructed sense of self. The creature that has lived its entire existence in the depths of the ocean cannot suddenly be brought to the surface without experiencing the decompression as violence. Your light represents a pressure they cannot withstand, not because it is harsh or judgmental, but because it emanates from a level of consciousness they have never allowed themselves to inhabit. Your integration threatens their disintegration, not by causing it, but by making it visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore, and so they may flee from your presence, or attempt to extinguish your light, or convince others that your radiance is actually a form of darkness. They may create elaborate mythologies about your supposed superiority complex, your imagined arrogance, your alleged cruelty in shining so brightly while they remain in shadow. But these stories reveal nothing about you and everything about their own relationship to the light, their terror of it, their hunger for it, their simultaneous attraction to and repulsion from the very thing that could set them free. The light you carry is not the harsh glare of the interrogation room, designed to expose and humiliate. It is more like the gentle dawn that slowly illuminates the landscape, revealing both beauty and decay, both growth and decomposition, both shadow and light as natural aspects of the whole. This light does not seek to destroy their darkness, but to illuminate it, not to eliminate their shadow, but to help them recognize it as part of their completeness, rather than something to be banished or projected onto others. But they cannot yet see this. They cannot yet understand that your light is not their enemy, but their deepest longing made manifest. They cannot yet recognize that your healing is not a judgment upon their woundedness, but a promise of what might be possible if they could find the courage to face their own depths, to embrace their own shadow, to risk the terror of authentic self-discovery. Until they can find this courage, Your light will remain unbearable to them, not because it is harsh or cruel, but because it is too beautiful, too whole, too real for their fragmented psyche to absorb. You have become living proof that the cave is not the only reality, that the shadows are not the only truth, that the journey toward wholeness, while terrifying, is not only possible but sacred. In their presence, you may be tempted to dim your light, to make yourself smaller, to accommodate their comfort with darkness. But this would be a betrayal, not only of your own journey, but of the possibility that your light might eventually become not a source of torment, but a beacon of hope, a gentle reminder that no one need remain forever in the cave, that healing is possible, that the light they cannot yet bear might one day become the light that finally guides them home to themselves. In the ancient laboratories of the soul, where the alchemists labored over their mysterious vessels and watched the dance of dissolution and coagulation, there was a stage in the great work that they called mortificatio, the necessary death, the required putrefaction, the sacred decomposition that must occur before new life can emerge. This was not merely a metaphor, but a psychological truth carved in the very bones of transformation. That which refuses to die remains forever trapped in the liminal space between authenticity and illusion. Your healing has triggered this alchemical process, not only within your own psyche, but in the energetic field that surrounds all relationship. You have willingly entered the tomb of your false self, allowed the constructed identity to decompose in the darkness, felt the terror of ego, unemerged from that darkness transformed. You have died the death that leads to rebirth, descended into the underworld of your own unconscious, and returned bearing the gold of genuine selfhood. But they, the ones whose false selves have become so elaborate and sophisticated that they mistake them for reality itself, they remain caught in the first stage of the mortificatio, frozen at the threshold of necessary death, unable to surrender the illusion, yet unable to fully inhabit it. Your transformation stands before them like a ghost at the feast, a reminder of the death they refuse to die, a mirror reflecting the stagnation they have chosen over growth. The false self, you see, is perhaps the most elegant psychological construction the human mind can create. Built in the crucible of early wounding, forged in the fire of survival necessity, it represents the adaptive genius of a psyche that learned to become what it needed to become in order to receive love, avoid abandonment, maintain safety. The false self is not inherently pathological. It is a masterpiece of psychological engineering, a testament to the soul's fierce commitment to survival. But what begins as an adaptive strategy becomes, over time, a golden cage. The false self that once protected the authentic child now imprisons the adult soul. The persona that once secured love now prevents genuine intimacy. The constructed identity that once guaranteed survival now blocks the possibility of truly living. The very mechanism that saved them has become the thing that destroys them. And they cannot see the difference because they have lived inside this construction for so long that they believe it to be their true home. The narcissist's false self is not merely a protective shell, it is a complete alternate reality, a parallel universe of identity that feels more real than reality itself. They have poured so much life force into maintaining this construction, have invested so much energy in perfecting its presentation, have sacrificed so much authentic experience to feed its hunger for validation, that the prospect of its death feels tantamount to their own annihilation. This is why your healing becomes not just a personal triumph, but an existential threat to their psychological architecture. You have proven that the false self can die without taking the person with it. You have demonstrated that beneath the constructed identity lies not emptiness, but essence, Not void, but vitality. Not death, but deeper life. Your emergence from the mortificatio alive and renewed makes their continued residence in the tomb of illusion. Not just tragic, but inexcusable. They watch your transformation with the horror of one witnessing a resurrection. They believed impossible. You have done what they were convinced could not be. You have allowed your false self to die, and discovered that you not only survived, but became more truly yourself than ever before. You have proven that their greatest fear, the fear of dissolution, of death, of losing the identity they have spent a lifetime constructing, is actually the gateway to their greatest freedom. But this revelation brings not joy, but fury, not inspiration, but rage, not hope, but despair. For your successful passage through the mortificatio strips away their last excuse for remaining in the comfortable prison of their false self. They can no longer claim that authenticity is impossible, that vulnerability is dangerous, that the constructed self is the only viable option. Your existence as a transformed being demolishes their philosophical justification for psychological stagnation. The death of the false self is not a gentle fading away, but a violent dissolution. A psychological apocalypse that dismantles every structure upon which identity has been built. It requires facing the original wound that necessitated the construction of the false self in the first place. It demands feeling the full weight of abandoned authenticity, of sacrificed spontaneity, of murdered naturalness. It calls for a grief so profound that it seems capable of drowning the entire personality in its depths. This is the death they refuse to die, not because they are cowards, but because the false self has become so sophisticated, so successful, so seemingly indispensable that they cannot imagine existence without it. They are like actors who have played the same role for so long that they have forgotten their original face. Artists who have painted over their authentic self so many times that they believe the surface layer is all that exists. The full self speaks in their voice, makes their decisions, forms their relationships, shapes their career, determines their values. It has become the puppet master, pulling the strings of their life, while they mistake themselves for the marionette. To kill the full self would mean acknowledging that much of what they have considered their greatest achievements, their most important relationships, their core beliefs about themselves and the world, all of this has been built on a foundation of illusion. Your rebirth from the ashes of your own false self makes visible what they have tried so hard to keep hidden, that they too are living a life that is not their own, pursuing goals that belong to someone else, maintaining relationships based on presentation rather than presence, seeking validation for an identity that is not actually them. Your authenticity illuminates their inauthenticity with such stark clarity that they cannot deny it, cannot rationalize it, cannot explain it away. This is why they hate you, not for who you are, but for what you represent. You are the road not taken, the choice not made, the death not died, the birth not allowed. You are living proof that another way is possible, that the prison of the false self is not a life sentence, that the original wound that necessitated the construction can be healed. You are the mirror that reflects not their face, but their unlived life, not their achievements, but their abandonment of authentic ambition, not their relationships, but their isolation from genuine connection. They rage against you because you have done what they believed was impossible, have walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and emerged into the light of authentic being. You have faced the terror of psychological dissolution and discovered that what dissolves is only what was never real to begin with. You have allowed the full self to die its necessary death and found that what remains is not emptiness, but essence. not void but fullness, not death but more abundant life. But they remain entombed in their own mausoleum of constructed identity, neither fully alive nor completely dead, existing in the liminal space of psychological limbo. They are the living dead, animated by artificial purposes, motivated by borrowed dreams, sustained by external validation, rather than internal vitality. They have achieved a kind of immortality, not of the soul, but of the ego, not of essence, but of illusion, not of being, but of seeming. The mortificatio calls to them through every encounter with your transformed presence. It whispers through the cracks in their constructed identity, speaks through the moments when their false self fails to provide the satisfaction it once promised, cries out through the increasing energy required to maintain their elaborate persona. But they plug their ears to its call, afraid that to listen would mean facing the death they have spent a lifetime avoiding. Yet the alchemists knew a secret that remains true across all ages and all psyches. The death that is refused in consciousness will be imposed by life itself. The false self that will not voluntarily die will eventually be killed by the sheer exhaustion of maintaining what is not real, by the increasing emptiness of pursuing what does not satisfy, by the growing isolation that comes from relating through presentation rather than presence. Your successful navigation of the mortificatio stands as both invitation and indictment invitation to join you in the country of the authentically alive, indictment of their choice to remain citizens of the kingdom of the psychologically dead. You are proof that rebirth is possible, making their continued residence in the tomb of the false self not just a personal tragedy but a cosmic refusal of their own deepest nature. The death of their false self awaits them still, patient as geological time, inevitable as the turning of seasons, certain as the law of psychological gravity that pulls all constructed identities back toward the earth of authentic being. But until they find the courage to die this necessary death, they remain suspended between worlds, too defended to fully live, too afraid to completely die, trapped in the purgatory of their own making, witnesses to your resurrection yet unable to begin their own. There comes a moment in every hero's journey when the seeker realizes they have been walking in circles, spiral, ever inward toward a destination that was never distant, never hidden, never lost, only forgotten. This is the moment of the sacred return, when you discover that the temple you have spent lifetimes seeking was always there, nestled in the secret garden of your own being, waiting with infinite patience for your recognition, your remembrance, your homecoming. The sacred temple of self is not built from stone or wood, but from the luminous substance of integrated consciousness. Its foundations are laid with hard-won wisdom, its walls constructed from boundaries that bend without breaking, its roof raised by the marriage of strength and surrender. In its innermost sanctuary, the ego and soul perform their eternal dance, no longer adversaries locked in combat, but partners who have learned the sacred choreography of Individuation. Here, in this Holy of Holies, the ego finally understands its proper role, not as tyrant or slave, but as steward of the sacred flame. It tends the altar fires of daily existence while remaining transparent to the deeper mysteries that move through it. It speaks when speech serves the soul's purpose, remains silent when silence deepens the connection to what is essential. It protects without possessing, chooses without forcing, acts without attachment to outcome, and the soul, no longer exiled to the unconscious depths, no longer forced to communicate only through symptoms and synchronicities, emerges into the light of conscious partnership. Its ancient wisdom informs the ego's choices, Its timeless perspective tempers the ego's urgency. Its unconditional love transforms the ego's defensive strategies into expressions of authentic strength. This is the sacred marriage that Jung called the hieros, garmos, the union of opposites that gives birth to the self as living reality rather than theoretical concept. In this temple, you are neither the wounded child seeking rescue nor the inflated adult claiming invulnerability. You are the whole human being, capable of holding both light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, knowing and unknowing, in the spacious embrace of integrated consciousness. But outside the gates of this inner sanctuary, there wanders another. Figure one who remembers, with the terrible clarity of the exiled, what paradise looked like before the fall. The narcissist, frozen in their primal wound, remains forever outside the temple of authentic self, pressing their face against windows they cannot break, crying out in languages they have forgotten how to speak. They watch you move within your sacred space with something beyond envy, beyond rage, with the grief of the fallen angel who remembers flying but has forgotten how wings work. Your peace is not simply something they covet. It is something they recognize, with the bone-deep knowing of the eternally homeless. Your integration is not merely what they want. It is what they once were, before the great splitting that tore their psyche into fragments that could never quite find their way back to wholeness. In their watching, they see themselves as they might have been. In your healing, they glimpse the path they were meant to walk. In your return to self, they witness the homecoming they have spent lifetimes avoiding. And this recognition becomes the source of their deepest hatred, not because you have harmed them, but because you have achieved what they believe is forever beyond their reach. Their fury is the tantrum of the permanently displaced, the rage of those who have built their entire identity around the fiction that the temple of self is either non-existent or empty. Your mere existence within your sacred space shatters this comforting delusion. Your peace invalidates their investment in chaos. Your wholeness exposes the bankruptcy of their fragmentation. But beneath their hatred pulses a grief so profound it could flood entire continents. They mourn not just for what they have lost, but for what they never allowed themselves to find. They weep not only for the paradise they have been expelled from, but for the keys to the kingdom they threw away in moments of prideful choosing. They grieve not simply for your love, but for their own capacity to love, which they buried beneath layers of protection so thick that even they can no longer remember where they placed it. This is why their rage at your healing carries such particular venom. It is not the anger of the competitor who has lost a race, but the anguish of the self-exiled who realized that the gates of home were never actually locked. The temple of self excludes no one except those who exclude themselves. The sacred return is available to every consciousness willing to lay down its weapons and walk, unarmed and undefended, into the mystery of its own depths. They sense this terrible truth in their bones, even as their minds construct elaborate fortifications against its implications. They know, with the knowing that exists beneath all their careful unknowing, that their exile is self-imposed, their exclusion self-created, their homelessness a choice they continue to make with every breath that refuses to soften, every heartbeat that insists on remaining closed. Your return to the sacred temple of self becomes their daily confrontation with their own refusal to make the journey. Your integration becomes their hourly reminder of their chosen fragmentation. Your peace becomes their constant evidence of the war they insist on fighting against their own deepest nature in the most profound moments of their witnessing. They almost remember who they were before the great forgetting. They almost recall the feeling of wholeness before the splitting began. They almost recognize themselves in the mirror of your integrated being, but these moments of recognition are too threatening to their carefully constructed identity as the permanently wounded, the eternally victimized, the forever excluded. So they turn recognition into resentment, remembrance into rage, homecoming into hatred. They make of your healing a personal affront, your peace a deliberate provocation, your joy a calculated cruelty. They interpret your return to self as evidence of your departure from them, your integration as proof of your indifference, your wholeness as confirmation of your heartlessness. But you, dwelling now in the sacred temple of your own being, begin to understand their hatred with the compassion that comes from secure belonging. You see their rage as the thrashing of the drowning, their persecution as the desperation of the lost, their cruelty as the confused striking out of those who have forgotten the way home to themselves. This understanding does not excuse that behavior, but it illuminates its source. The hatred of your healing springs from the same wellspring as their original capacity for love. They are both expressions of their essential nature, one distorted by fear and the other waiting to be reclaimed through courage. Their rage at your peace emerges from the same core as their potential for serenity. Both are voices of the soul, one screaming in exile and the other whispering invitations to return. From within your temple, you can see what they cannot, that the gates remain open, that the path remains clear, that the sacred return is always available to any consciousness willing to undertake the journey. But you also understand what they refuse to acknowledge, that no one can make this journey for another, that no amount of external validation can substitute for the inner work of integration, that no healing can be transferred from one psyche to another like a coat passed between friends. Your compassion for their exile does not require you to leave your sanctuary. Your understanding of their grief does not obligate you to abandon your peace. Your recognition of their essential nature does not mean you must tolerate their destructive behavior. The sacred temple of self is spacious enough to hold love for those who cannot love themselves, but its boundaries are strong enough to prevent such love from becoming self-betrayal. In the deepest wisdom of your return, you realize that your healing serves not only yourself, but the collective unconscious of humanity. Every consciousness that finds its way home to the sacred temple of integrated self creates a pathway that others might follow. Every soul that achieves the marriage of ego and essence becomes a lighthouse for those still wandering in the darkness of their own divisions. Your return illuminates their exile, not to shame them, but to show them that exile is not permanent, that fragmentation is not final, that the fallen angel can remember how to fly. Your integration demonstrates their potential, not to judge them, but to remind them that wholeness is their birthright, not your privilege. And in the most mystical moments of your dwelling within the sacred temple, you understand that even their hatred serves the greater purpose of awakening. Their rage at your peace forces you to deepen your rootedness in serenity. Their attacks on your boundaries compel you to strengthen your sacred barriers. Their persecution of your healing drives you further into the inviolable sanctuary of your own truth. They become, in their twisted way, the guardians of your transformation, not by protecting it, but by challenging it so relentlessly that it must become diamond strong to survive. Their hatred purifies your love by burning away everything that is not essential. Their exile deepens your homecoming by showing you, again and again, what it means to be truly lost and what it takes to be genuinely found in the end. Your sacred return becomes a gift not only to yourself, but to the entire web of consciousness. in which you are embedded. Your peace ripples outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Your integration creates resonance fields that other souls can feel, even if they cannot yet understand what they are sensing. Your dwelling in the temple of authentic self becomes a beacon of possibility for anyone who has ever felt homeless in their own skin. The narcissist, in their eternal exile, may never understand that your healing was never about abandoning them, but always about finding your way back to the truth of who you have always been. Your return to self was not a departure from love, but an arrival at its source. Your integration was not a rejection of relationship, but a preparation for authentic connection with those capable of meeting you in the sacred space of mutual wholeness. And so you dwell in peace within the temple of your integrated being, tending the eternal flame of your own sacred nature, dancing the ancient dance of ego and soul, holding space for both the love that heals and the boundaries that protect. You have made the sacred return, not to where you started, but to who you have always been, beneath all the forgetting, all the wounding, all the long and winding paths that led you, finally, inexorably, home.